Thank you very much. Good evening. How are you doing?
Hey.
Excellent. So my name is Gary West, and it's my great honour to be chairing this event with one of Scotland's very finest storytellers. And I do believe that, not just because he's sitting 3 feet away from me. I do regularly say that. I've been a big fan of James's work for many years. He's one of our finest storytellers who's writing in and of Scotland. His work touches many different bases. He's one of these writers, I think, that it's fair to say it's very hard to pigeonhole. And that's a good thing. But there are certain things that certainly bring his work together and come out of his work, and Scotland is one of them. A lot of his work is based in Scotland. He shines a light on all the kinds of nooks and crannies of our world here in Scotland. Politics, society, culture, religion, and all of these things are certainly in this book that we'll be talking about tonight. But he also, I think it's fair to say, has that real skill of making the very local, the very particular, the very individual link to the universal. And he certainly writes about some of the big issues of humanity and inhumanity, things that are timeless and that are always on our minds as human beings. So I'm delighted to get a chance to chew the fat with James Robertson. Another round of applause for James. James, I'll put my tuppence worth on the table immediately. I really like this book. You'll be glad to know, because it would be a bit crap if I didn't, I guess.
If you were going to just give me a slagging, that would be a bit off. Yes.
Does that ever happen, I wonder? Does the chair hate the book that they're talking about? But I love it for many reasons, and there's so many layers, of course, in this book. Layers of time, layers of characters, layers of stories that all intertwine. I suppose the one thing that binds them all together is place, and a very particular place. I wonder if you could maybe start by taking us there to the Glen.
Yeah, so the novel is set entirely in a place called Glen Connacht. I live in Angus. I live about 10 miles north of Dundee, and if you go another 20 miles further north, you reach the glens of Angus, very beautiful part of Scotland, and there are a number of these glens that run up into, well, eventually, if you follow them right up to the very top, you get into the Cairngorms. So it's a beautiful part of the country. So Glen Connacht is one of those glens in Angus, except that it's an imaginary one. I didn't want to locate this story, or these stories, perhaps I should say. I didn't want to locate them in a place that was real. I wanted to locate them in a place that was very close to these real places, but actually was imaginary. And that meant that I was able to populate it with people over a very long period of time, that I could just fit in the people that I wanted to be there. So you're right. Place is the thing that connects everything that's going on in this book, but there are at least 3 different stories happening in the book over a very, very long period of time. One of them is set about 1,500 years ago, I would guess. Is that right? Yeah, 1,500 years ago, in about the 7th or 8th century, and concerns the man after whom the glen is named, a man called Connacht, who comes there. He's a Christian missionary to the Picts, and he comes there to retreat from the world and become a hermit in about the sort of 700s. And then the second story, which also takes place in the Glen, takes place about 1,000 years later than that, in the early part of the 19th century, by which time the population has changed. There's a big hoose, and there are folk working off the land there. It's the time of the Napoleonic Wars, and so there's a second story that happens in that period. And then the third part of the story happens in the late 20th century and right up to the present day. So there's kind of 2 stories going on in the modern period. So they're all hundreds of years apart, but they are connected by place. And the other thing that connects them is a manuscript which we'll maybe talk about a wee bit later. But there's a sort of thread of this manuscript and what it represents that links the 3 or 4 different stories together.
Yeah, and as you say, we'll maybe unpeel some of these layers as we go. One, you mentioned the Napoleonic War period, early 19th century, 1809, I think specifically. And a chap arrives into the Glen, and we'll talk about him in detail maybe later, but he's an antiquarian, he claims. I don't think he knows what that is, or he's not terribly sure if he knows what that is. He's a chancer, for sure, as we'll maybe see. But he goes to the big house. And I wonder if you could introduce us to his hosts in the big house.
Okay, so the book starts with a kind of little prelude in the year 2019, I guess 2019, 2020. But then we go back in time to 1809, and this man Charles Gibb arrives in the Glen, and he's come because he's heard about this manuscript which exists and which is now kept in the library of the big house, and he wants to explore it. He wants to get a look at it. Because, as you say, he's a historian, he's an antiquarian. He's quite good at that kind of work, that research work. But he is also, as you've hinted, he's a charlatan. And what he really wants to do is come to the house, look at the manuscript, make a fair copy of it, make a translation of it, because it's in Latin. But he wants to eke this out for as long as he possibly can, because that's how he makes his living. He goes from one big house to another, looking at artifacts, things that they've got in their libraries, bits of ruined stones that they might have on their land. And he basically stays for as long as he possibly can, getting free bed and board, while he investigates whatever it is the laird or the owner of the house has to offer. So when his story opens, it's, as I say, it's 1809. He has walked he's walked plus cadged lifts from Stirling all the way up to Dundee, and then from there to Forfar. I don't know how good your geography is for that neck of the woods, but he's then walked from Forfar all the way up to Glenconach, which is about a 25-mile walk, and he's done it and set off early in the morning. He gets there about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So he's pretty tired. Also, the road is terrible, and it's been pouring with rain all day, so he is completely soaking wet. So he's not in the best frame of mind when he arrives. And he arrives to find that the Baron of Glenconach, who was the man that invited him to come, has completely forgotten that he was going to turn up. And when he arrives, there's an argument going on between the Baron and his wife about whether or not to light the fire because it's so wet and damp there. And Charles Gibb is writing a journal, so this is an extract from his journal. I should note here some of the characteristics of this Baron of Glenconach, the 5th of that title to bear the name Milne. Having observed him at close quarters for 3 days now, I may fairly describe him as a shaggy tree of a man who, when upright, always seems on the point of overbalancing and crashing to earth. He apparently spent much of his life wearing a wig, but at the start of the new century abandoned all forms of headdress in or out of doors after deciding on no particular evidence that wigs, hats, turbans and nightcaps trap germs and make a man ill. He's about 63 or 4 and claims not to have had a single cold since he gave up covering his head. He told me himself that he shaves his face and neck twice a week, but on the Samsonite principle that it is the source of his strength, he does not permit the cutting of his hair, which is sparse, long and unruly and sticks out in every direction. This makes him appear not only arborescent, but also, regardless of the time of day, as if he has only recently risen from sleep. He finds modern life bewildering and ridiculous and tries to avoid it by staying away from overpopulated places such as Edinburgh and Forfar. You'd better get out of the things and into some dry anes, Lady Glenconach said to me. I'll have some hot water sent to your room. Where have you left your baggage? I had none, But before I could say so, she spoke again to her husband. If we'd kent, Jock McLeish could have brought it on his cart. And then to me, Jock was here not an hour since, with a dozen dining chairs we'd been waiting on for weeks. No baggage for me, madam, I told her. I came on foot. What we need a dozen dining chairs for is beyond me, the Baron said. 4 would more than suffice. We already have chairs. What we want is cheese. Did Jock bring the Dunlop, as I asked? The chairs are either rotten or broken, and the breaking was mostly your doing, his lady replied. I've taken the dozen as an insurance against future losses. And yes, Jock did bring a whole cheese. It's as big as a wheel. But Mr. Gibb, now that I think on it, he must have passed you. He offered to take you up, surely. I knew nothing about any Jock McLeish, but assumed that it was his cart that I had seen departing as I approached the house. That he had not assisted me was not his fault. I explained that I had missed him on account of having taken the wrong road. How could you take the wrong road, the Baron asked, or rather roared. There is only the one. I said that I thought I'd identified a shortcut, but it turned out to be a long cut, and there'd been a burn to cross. To be more accurate, although it was probably a burn most days, it was a raging torrent that afternoon. Well, you must get dry at once, the Baroness said. Our daughter, Jessamine, will get out some things of Alexander's for you. He's our son, you ken. He's away with his regiment just now, the Black Watch, waiting to engage the French once more. You look about the same size. Sandy's not so fat in the middle, the Baron observed, with no thought at all for my feelings. His wife ignored him. Did you say you'd not brought anything with you? She asked, fixing me with a commanding look, one that I've come to know well in these last few days. A word about this impressive person, Margaret Milne, or Lady Glenconach. She is tall and tidy, a garden cane to her husband's unruliness. When she stands at his side, they resemble the figure 10. A year or two younger than whatever age he is, she has a long, thin nose above a mouth that seems often about to smile but seldom does, and even then in a restrained manner. On her head, she grows a crop of grey curls, which she usually keeps neatly drilled below a lace cap tied under her chin. She's very intelligent and practical, and manages the Baron and the household without fuss, and on the principle that nothing will happen unless she organises it. She has a strong desire for order and peace, but whereas in many women this leads to an absence of humour, she seems to be constantly amused by life and quite content in herself. Yesterday, for example, I saw her creep up on the Baron with scissors when he was asleep in his chair and snip off the most extreme bits of his foliage, carrying them away without his knowing that it had been pruned. This was obviously both an entertainment and a regular duty to her. The laird must surely wonder that his hair never grows beyond a certain length, but if he suspects his wife of playing Delilah, he keeps his suspicions to himself. As far as I can ascertain, Lady Glenconach has but 2 sources of worry. One is the safety of her son, Alexander, lately in Iberia, fighting the French, and now in Kent, awaiting embarkation to some new theatre of war. And the other is for her daughter, Jessamine, who has reached the ancient age of 24. It is obviously a difficulty, since Miss Milne never gets out of the glen, and few eligible men get into it, as to how she is to be wooed, let alone wed. I felt these last few days the mother's assessing eye upon me, but of course, being penniless and without pedigree, I'm completely unsuitable. This is to say nothing of Miss Milne's misfortune in her appearance, of which more anon.
Thank you, James. A beautiful description of Lord and Lady, the Baron and Baroness, Glenconach. And just a word or two about language, maybe. You're a very committed Scots speaker and writer of Scots, and a great supporter of the language in your own publishing as well as your own writing. It might be surprising to some people, and it was to me, I have to say, that someone or a pair of people of their social standing had gid Scots tongues in their head in the early 19th century. And I know you are meticulous with your research, so I'm sure that was the case. But no RP for them in those days.
No, but I think what's happening at that period in Scottish history, the late 18th and early 19th century, is that there's a bit of a shift taking place. If you go back maybe even 50 years before then virtually all classes in Scotland spoke Scots habitually, but through the latter part of the 18th century, you find that the aristocracy and the sort of learned middle classes are beginning to educate themselves away from Scots. They're learning to speak English as purely as they can because they think that's how they'll get on in the world. And certainly the intellectuals of the Enlightenment in Edinburgh at the time, they go to great pains to make sure that the English that they're writing down is real English. So they try to exercise all the Scotticisms, and lots of charlatans, a bit like Charles Gibb, actually tutor them as to how to do this, to get rid of the Scotticisms from their language. So we're right on the cusp here where people of a certain class in society are losing their Scots, but of course everybody below them still speaks nothing but Scots, and in the Glen that's the case. So the Baron and Baroness, they have to be able to speak Scots in order to get on with the folk that live on their land and the cotters that live around them. But they're also good at switching, and so is Jessie, their daughter. They have enough visitors coming in from elsewhere who speak English that they've learned how to speak English as well. And I think very much at that point it's about having two languages and being able to switch. And the residue of that is still around today. There are still plenty of folk who are able to do that if they have to, depending upon the circumstances that they're speaking in. And the other thing I think is also that we're talking about rural Angus here, so it's not quite as sophisticated as even Dundee or Edinburgh would have been at that time. So there's still a certain sort of the Baron and his wife, although they're definitely in a social class above the cotters that live on the land, they don't actually have a lot of money. They've got a big house, but they don't have much money to keep it going. So they kind of, their empathies, their sympathies, if you like, lie with the people that live on their land.
And while we're on language, you've set yourself quite a challenge here, because you're writing often in the first person with some of the different storytellers who are telling their stories, as you've already said, hundreds of years apart. So the style, the register, I suppose we would call it, changes constantly through the book. You've got a 12th century chronicler and how he or she would have written, a monk presumably. You've got the period we've just looked at. You've got the 20th century. You've got some academic papers in there and so on. You like to make life difficult for yourself, don't you?
To me, that's one of the riches of doing a book like this that's spread over a long period of time, because, again, it's all taking place in one place, but there are folk coming and going all the time over that long period, and they all sound and speak differently, or many of them do. But you mentioned that the monk who writes down the stories about Connacht that become this manuscript, the Book of Connacht, that, of course, originally is written in Latin. But when Charles Gibb comes, he wants to make a translation of it into English. But that's a kind of formal English compared with what he's writing down in his journal, for example. And in order to try and so there are different voices, and in order to try and get the right voice for that manuscript, the Book of Connacht, right, I read quite widely around some of the lives of the Celtic saints that were written down in manuscript form, usually in Latin, and then translated at a later period. And there's a sort of tone that they all have that is quite similar. I suppose the most famous of these is the life of Columba, which is written down by somebody who actually knew him, 40 or 50 years after Columba's death. But in this case, the stories of Connacht aren't written down until about 500 years has passed between him and them being written down. So there's already a sense there that there's a gap between the reality of Connacht's life and the person who records it. And I think that's another thing that's going on in the book all the time is, can you trust the voice? Can you trust the manuscript or the document that you're reading? Charles Gibbs's journal is another case in point, because when we or you, the reader, read it, you're reading it having been rediscovered in the early 21st century. So that's been something that's been hidden away for a couple of hundred years. So there's a whole lot of games being played there with the voices and how the voices get written down on pieces of paper as well.
Yeah. That's one of the things I find fascinating about the book is the reliability. We've got history there, we've got tradition there, we've got folklore. You're never quite sure which is which, if you can separate them anyway. I'd like to come back and explore that in a moment or two. But just before we leave that kind of language and register thing, I mean, the register is so different that did you find yourself writing all of one of them and then going to all of the other, or did you wake up on a Monday morning and say, right, this week I'm going to be mainly a 12th century monk, or how does that work?
Well, with the way that I write books basically is I don't often know exactly where. I know roughly where the destination is going to be, but I haven't got it all mapped out. And for me, that's the interesting thing about writing a novel, is I don't exactly know where it's going to take me. So in this case, I had a number of false starts, if you like. I began with the book going to be about something quite different, about the notion of hermits and hermitages, and we might come back to talk about that in a wee minute. But then I thought about writing the book, the manuscript about the life of this man Connacht, this Celtic missionary who some of the local people call him a saint, but he's not really a saint. He hasn't been sort of sanctified by the church, but he to them he feels like a saint. So I wrote most of the Book of Connacht in one shot, and at first, again, I thought that when the novel was finished, I thought that might be how the reader would read it, all in one chunk. But in fact, it turned out that it was easier to split that up. So you get 2 or 3 chapters of the Book of Connacht. They're very short. I'll read one of them in a minute. You get a few samples of the book, of the manuscript, and then you go back to one of the other stories. So I wrote chunks of each story, and then, as it were, split them up. That's I shouldn't really be telling you that. It should be a mystery, but that's how I do it. I think it took me about 5 or 6 drafts to get this to where I wanted it to be. So it's a long process, and you make lots of mistakes. You go down. I find I make lots of mistakes. I go down various cul-de-sacs and then have to come back again. Sometimes to rewrite, sometimes to change the voice of the story that I'm writing the story in. For example, Charles Gibbs' story wasn't originally his journal. It was I told it in the third person, as if I was a sort of omniscient narrator talking about him. But then I realised that it was much better for him to tell the story and write it down in a journal. Partly because it makes him the narrator and therefore an unreliable narrator, so that as you're reading it, you don't know if what he's telling you is really true or not. But I could give you possibly a wee extract from the Book of Connacht, just to give people a sense of what's going on there. So the Book of Connacht is, as I say, it's a manuscript. It's been written down by a monk probably about 1,000 years ago, and it's divided into chapters. They're very short, so I'll just read one of these. It's only about a page long. Of course, it was originally written in Latin, but I'll let you off and read it in English just to make things easier for everybody. So this is about, the chapter is just called Of the Wild Man of the Glen. And when Connacht comes into the glen and decides he wants to settle here and be a hermit, he cheats a bit, really, because he brings a servant with him, which to my mind is not really, hermits should just go off and do it all by themselves. But clearly, if you were high enough up, your status was good enough, then you could bring a servant with you to be a hermit. But they discovered that there's already somebody living in the glen who is a real hermit. It was true what the people had said, that a wild man lived high up in the glen. They were afraid of him. He was a mighty man, fleet and agile in his nakedness. He could climb the tallest tree in the time it took an ordinary man to walk the same distance on a flat piece of ground. He could creep up on a hare and catch it before it could run the length of its shadow. He lived on berries and nuts and the raw flesh of fish and other creatures. Yet he was wretched as an ape, and cut and bruised himself upon the rocks, and howled so piteously at night that even the wolves were silenced when they heard him. One day, not long after Connacht's arrival, while Talorg, his servant, and some others were building him his dwelling, you see, he gets away with that, doesn't he? He doesn't have to build his own house. The holy man was led by the Spirit into the wastes to pray. As he was praying aloud, the wild man came upon him, beseeching him to desist and to leave that place. Connacht conversed with the man, who said that he too had once been a faithful servant of God, but had fallen into sin, and must suffer on earth until the day he was taken up into the arms of Christ. Connacht asked him his name, but the man said he had none. Connacht asked what was the nature of his transgression, and the man wept but would not say, begging only to be left alone. But Connacht refused to go. Then the man seized the psalter that Connacht had made and that he kept always with him, and ran away with it into the forest. And he cast the psalter into the river, and the river carried it away, and it was lost. And fierce was Connacht's rage against the wild man. But the next day, as I have been told, it happened that an otter hunting for fish far downstream found the psalter and took it in its teeth and brought it to the holy man and laid it at his feet. And the book was not marked by the teeth of the otter, nor was the writing in it spoilt by the water. When the wild man appeared again, Connacht showed him the book, saying, "See how your wickedness is repaid, for evil is powerless against the word and cannot defeat it. Even a creature that lives below the bank of the river knows this, yet you know it not." Then the wild man gnashed his teeth and cried out against Connacht, "The devil shall tempt you as he tempted me, and you shall do penance even as I have done." And he fled again into the forest. And Connacht gave thanks to God for the salvation of the book, and prayed for the salvation of the demented man. That sets up something that happens later on in the book, because Connacht, although he's a holy man and saintly and so on, he also is riding for a fall, as we discover later on in the book. But I'm not going to talk about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, the wild man, the hermit, it's fascinating that, and just to come back to the point you made a moment or two ago, which was the starting point of you writing the book, the building of a hermitage, a building of a place for a wild man, which took place, and there was a fashion for this, I think, in the 18th century, was it? In the sort of late 18th century.
Sort of second half of the 18th century.
It's kind of invention of tradition in some ways, or a...
Yes, I think it's at the period. I mean, it happened not just in Scotland; it happened all over England and Ireland and on the continent as well. But yes, I think people were going, kind of saying, "Well, where are we from? What's the history of our people? What are the myths that we still have going on in the background that we think are important?" And so they were looking for, in the same way that the sort of rediscovery of the classical world had led people to go back and look at the Greek and Roman myths, they were looking for mythologies of their own. And one of the things that became very fashionable was the idea that if you were a guy with a big house and a bit of land, that you would actually build a hermitage somewhere on your property, and it might be quite an ornate place. It might be just a kind of a hut made of twigs and branches and so on. Sometimes they made them under the roots of trees. Sometimes it was a cave. But they actually employed somebody to be the hermit. And there are job adverts from this period which you can still look at. And they were pretty rigorous, the terms and conditions of your labour. If you got the job to be the hermit, then you weren't allowed to cut your hair, you weren't allowed to wash or cut your fingernails. You basically had to live in rags, for 6 a week or whatever your pay was. But when your employer brought his friends to kind of look at you. You were supposed to kind of disappear off into the woods and not really be seen and not converse with them. And there was a trend for this, and there were people employed, for a while as hermits. And that was where I thought this, when I first read about that, I thought that's a brilliant scenario for a novel, to sort of test out what happens when somebody comes along and then, goes on strike for higher wages or something like that. This relationship between the landowner and the hermit. But by the time I got right deep into the book, it had shifted, and I was more interested in finding out about a hermit from 1,000 years ago. But there is a little residual bit of that original where I started still in the book, which forms a little central part of the book as well.
I bet we're all sitting here thinking, I know a guy who could have applied for that job.
Yeah.
Great job in many ways. We've talked about a couple of the slices of time, and one of your great skills, I think, as a writer is you're a historical novelist in some senses, but you're always interested in how the past, or the shadows of the past, or the echoes of the past affect our present. And you're interested, I think, in things that bring the two together. And there's a lot of beautiful stuff here of bringing all these slices of time together. I suppose the one we haven't yet touched on is today. In fact, the book begins, as you mentioned earlier, today. And do you just want to say a little bit about the today part?
Okay, yeah. Well, I am very interested in history. I did a couple of history degrees when I was younger, and I'm interested in history not so much because I'm interested in the detail of what went on in the past, although of course I am interested in that, but I'm much more interested in how the past continues to affect the present, but also how the present continues to shape the past. Every time we look at the past, we find something about it that we didn't know, or our own prejudices or knowledge has shifted, and so we go back and basically revise what we know about the past. So I'm interested in how past and present actually influence each other all the time, constantly. So in this novel opens with a woman, an old woman. She's in her 80s, and her name is Maya. Maja, which is almost gives away a little clue about her, because that's not the kind of name you would necessarily expect somebody to have in an Angus Glen. She's the oldest resident of the Glen in the year 2019-2020. She doesn't know exactly how old she is. She's in her 80s, and one of her friends is a young lad called Lachie, who's 8 years old. Lachie is the son of the people who now live in the big house. And Lachie comes over to Maya's house, her little cottage, frequently to just spend time with her and talk to her. And one day he turns up and he asks her what a ghost is. And Maya, being a very sensitive person, doesn't kind of mock him for asking such questions. She asks him why he's interested. And he says, I'm not sure, but I think I might have seen a ghost. But he doesn't really know what he's seen. So she teases out of him that he's seen a figure of a wee girl, maybe a wee bit older than him, 9, 10 years old, barefoot in a kind of ragged dress, who seems to be wanting to speak to him but doesn't say anything to him. And Maya is fascinated by this because she wonders if this ghost is around, who it is, and she's possibly thinking that it might be connected with her own life because of things that have happened to her a long time ago. So the whole book is topped and tailed by the Maya story, the Maya Lachie story. It starts with them, and then it concludes with Maya's story at the end. And one of the things that's happening, it was kind of weird, when I thought I'd finished writing this novel at the end of 2019. I sent what I thought was the final copy of it, the final draft of it, to my editor and my wife and my agent. They all got to read it at the same time, and they all came back and said, yeah, it's okay, but there's still a few things here we're not quite sure about. And they were all the same things. Now, when three people who I respect as my readers, tell me there's something that's not quite right, I think, okay, I better have another look at this. So I agreed that I would go back in and maybe write another draft. And within 3 months of that happening, we all got hit with the arrival of COVID and lockdown. And so suddenly, the book, which we'd intended to publish in the summer of 2020, it looked as though that probably wasn't a very sensible thing to do because festivals were cancelled, all of that stuff wasn't happening. So I had the whole of 2020 to go through the book again. And I feel very lucky in a way that happened. But one of the few good things that has come out of COVID, as far as I'm concerned, is it made me go through the book again. And it actually made a lot of things that I hadn't quite seen how they were working fit into place. So there's this sense throughout the book, particularly with the story of Maya, that coronavirus is creeping towards the Glen. It's coming. They can see it coming across Asia, across Europe. It gets to the British Isles. And they know that eventually it's going to get even to a remote place like Glenconach. And Maya knows that because she's in her 80s and is the oldest person there, that if it's going to pick on anybody, she's probably the most likely person that it's going to pick on. So she's waiting for this thing to come. And that's making her think very hard about what has gone on in the rest of her life. So there's that theme of disease, fever, or illness coming towards them in the Glen in the present day, but that's a theme that it was actually already built into the earlier stories. So it's kind of weird. Sometimes I don't really know how that stuff happens. I think when you're writing a novel, you get so embedded into it. It's deep in your subconscious, and I think sometimes these things are there already, but you need a trigger to work out why they're there. And so for me, it was COVID-19 was the trigger to actually explain what was going on in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the way you bring it right up to date. And that relationship you were just talking about there between Maya and Lackey is a lovely one. It's a beautiful one. She is clearly a wise woman, and it seems to me there's a lot of wise women in this book. And they, migration, I suppose, is another theme, but I think it's Jessie at one point. She says, yes, the men leave, but the women have to stay.
Yeah. And
I suppose, is that just a lesson from history, I wonder?
Yeah. Again, it's kind of interesting because Charles Gibb, he's writing about himself. He clearly thinks that he's a cut above everybody else. Glenconach, the Baron, in his own slightly eccentric way, thinks that he's the bee's knees. There are other men in the book who clearly think that the world revolves around them, including perhaps Connacht himself back in the 8th century. But in fact, all the way through the book, it's the women that are keeping things going. And Charles Gibb, when he arrives and first meets Jessie, the daughter of the house, she's got a birthmark on her face, which and she appears to be slightly giddy and foolish and not very kind of sophisticated. So he thinks he's going to be able to dominate her and get the better of her. But he realizes quite quickly that, in fact, she's a lot smarter than he thought she was, and in many ways is a lot smarter than he is. And so there's a kind of contest that goes on between them. And the longer he stays, the more he realizes that the people in the Glen who, to begin with, he's kind of decided he's just going to exploit and thinks they're kind of country bumpkins. But the longer he stays, the more he realizes that they're not nearly as unsophisticated or stupid as he perhaps thought when he first arrived.
Yeah, that wisdom that Maya has is there in the Glen generally, I would say. And there's this lovely interplay also throughout the book between the written versions and what has lasted in oral tradition.
Yes.
And there's characters like Geordie, is it, who's the kind of bearer of these traditions in many ways. Yeah. And I'm just trying to. I see you thumbing through for another wee reading.
Just a wee one. It's just a page and a half or so, but it gives you a sense of. Again, most of these stories are told in the first person. So this is Maya telling her story, and she's going to talk about this man called Geordie Kemp, who was a great friend of hers, who lived in the Glen basically all his life. And it's about this thing, and Gary, as a collector, a folklorist, an ethnographer yourself, you know about this stuff, how stories get collected and how also they sometimes get changed depending upon who's telling the stories. So this is Maya recalling her friend Geordie Kemp, who's no longer alive in the year 2019. all the stories about Connacht were Geordie Kemp's. He had a wife, Betty, but she died years ago, long before he did. She and Geordie shared the Connacht stories between them. And after Betty went, Geordie had to keep them all in his head because he was the only one the only one left that had them. It was Geordie that those earlier folklorists, the ones that preceded Dr. Tybalt, had come to see. This is folk who came to write down the stories that Geordie had in his head, probably in the 1970s or 80s. They were mostly young men with beards and dark-framed glasses, and they came with heavy reel-to-reel tape recorders and later with smaller cassette machines, and they recorded him telling stories until he ran out. And then they would ask for more. He didn't like to disappoint them, so he would say he was tired and would have to have a think, and they were to come back in a month and be sure to bring another bottle of that fine whiskey when they did. And by the time they returned, he would have another batch of stories for them. He was a rogue, Geordie. He would order books of folk tales from the library van and read up on the kind of things the students liked and change the names or add a new twist to a story that came from somewhere else. And they loved it. I remember he told me once, "Oh, that's them a Norwegian tale and a Russian in, and they'll never ken the difference." They couldn't get enough of him, but he was canny. He knew what would make a good story and what would make a bad one. A good story, he said, had to have some element of truth in it, even if he'd made it up or stolen it. If it did not have that truth, even if it was the best tale of them all, it would fail. But anyway, some of his stories were very old, and as good as anything the academics had in their collections, and Geordie swore he'd had these ones from folk who were now dead, long before anybody from the universities was interested. Geordie was a labourer all his days, an outdoors man. He worked with sheep and cattle, but, as I told Lackey, many other jobs too. He was just the kind of person Lackey's parents could do with now. The thing he did best was building walls. He was a dry stone diker, and he was famous for it. His hands were like big claws, and he could use them like the bucket on a digger to move stones. But he could use them like a musician or a potter too. You could see his mind shaping the dike as he worked. The thoughts went down his arms and into his fingers, and he shifted and shoved and slotted stones into place like a conjurer. "It's just filling in spaces," he said, but it was much more than that. It was Geordie who repaired all the dikes round the estate. The last job he did was the big dike in the High Park. He was 85 when he started that. It took him 2 summers, a day here and a day there, but one day he finished it. That afternoon, he went home with a sore back and looking forward to a dram. "That's the last bloody stain I'm pitting on top of another stain," he said to Peter Darrach, who met him on his way home. Peter went on up to see the finished dike. "I'll come in later and settle up with you," Peter said. But death got there first. That was 5 years ago. Apart from when he was away in the army at the end of the war, Geordie was in the Glen all his life, and nobody could remember it without him. It was as if he had been here forever, like the birds and the other creatures, and that's something else about him. There was a roughness and a heat about him. Sometimes his eyes flashed at you, and you thought there was a dog or a fox or even some beast long gone from the Glen, hidden away in the depths of him, a wolf or a bear. But none of that made any difference at the end. One day he was building a dike, and the next he was gone. Death came for him, and I think he knew it was coming. He felt a change, maybe the way I'm feeling it now. I think when he said that about the last stone, he wasn't just complaining about his back. He was saying that that was him, done. Peter went in to pay him what he was still owed, and found him in his armchair with his boots off and his slippers on and his bonnet still on his head, and an empty glass on the table beside him. And that was Geordie Kemp's place. He was in it when death came calling, and he didn't even have to get up to open the door.
Beautifully done, beautifully done. I think we all know a Geordie somewhere or other, and I could go on.
There's actually a guy at the end of our street who's a champion Drysdale diker, but right. it's no him.
It's no him,
no, and he's still around.
I could go on asking you questions about this book all night, but time's getting on, and I just want to make sure we have enough time for any of you to ask some questions or make any points. These lights are bright; I can't quite see you, but would anyone like to ask? Yes, someone at the back there. I think there's a roving microphone. Yes, excellent.
Hey, James.
Hello.
I was just wondering, you were speaking there about the females in the book and how they were made to stay. But I was wondering if a theme in it as well was how the men stories were more believable. It was so Gibb wrote his stories were written down, but Maya's, she had to write them herself. And, there's a point in the book when, I forget his name, Tidedale or something, is interviewing her, and he's asking about Geordie's stories, and she tells him what she thinks, and he kind of dismisses it. Do you think that is something that you wanted to get across, how it depended on gender as well?
I got most of that thing. I think there is a sort of female-male thing going on there. About there's a bit of a competition between Jesse and Charles when they're trying to work out. He's making this translation of the manuscript, and she's going, "We need to put in more stuff here." Some of the stories that I've heard from the older women in the Glen. And he says, but they're not in the manuscript. And he says, yeah, but they should be. So there's a kind of competition there about what's authentic, what's genuine, because he's saying, well, I can't put it in if it's not in the manuscript. And she's saying, but why not? Why are the stories that have been handed down over hundreds of years orally any less authentic and genuine than what's written down, that some monk has supposedly written down a few hundred years ago? And then you're right, I think that is carried on down to the present day when Maya is sort of remembering the stories about that Geordie told her about Connacht. But then, as you say, she also decides that she has to write down her own story. I'm picking my words carefully here so as not to give too much away. But there's a constant tension between the spoken stories and the written down stories. I think that's right. And I suppose I've always been interested in that. In fact, I was thinking about it. Most of my novels sometimes seem to have sort of found manuscripts in them. And so I think I'm constantly playing with that idea about how do you know, or how can you trust that something that's written down is really telling you the truth? Because I think sometimes we assume that if it's written down, printed, then it must be true. And of course, that isn't always the case. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Some up towards the front here, I think I see some hands. Yeah.
To return to the idea of language, James, Lady Glenconach at one point says, how can you interpret anything about Scotland if you don't speak Scots? And I wonder if that's sort of a view that you hold, and how you would regard the words of George Robertson, the Labour politician, Baron Robertson of Port Ellen, as we must call him now. And he says, we, Scotland, don't have any language and culture.
Yeah, I don't know where to begin with that. I mean, we could be here for hours talking about that. I do genuinely, firmly believe that in order to understand the very complex culture of Scotland, you have to have some understanding of the languages that have fed into that, and that are part of that. I mean, language is such an integral part of anybody's identity, and when it's been around for as long as Scots has or Gaelic has, then of course it is going to have be an elemental part of a culture. So I just don't understand how anybody as intelligent as George Robertson presumably is, given his long career, could come out with such a statement. It just doesn't make any sense to me at all. So I think it's, and one of the things that I find fascinating about my lifetime, I suppose, is how from being denigrated often, Scots language particularly, and being kept out of schools and not being something that is part of anybody's education, we have now begun to change that to being a wee bit more inclusive. I think there's an awful long way to go still around that, but the attitude has changed quite a bit. It used to be, actually it was true of Gaelic as well. Speak Gaelic, speak Scots, and it'll hold you back. You won't be able to get on in life. Gradually we're beginning to change that attitude and be more inclusive about these languages, which are so fundamental to our understanding of what our history is. That's not in any way I mean, I'm a great believer in English. English is an amazing, wonderful language, and my belief is that folk in Scotland should be educated to be as articulate in the languages they wish to speak as they possibly can be, and that's whether that's Gaelic, Scots, French, English, Polish, or anything else. It seems to me that language is such a fundamental part of who anybody is, that to take that kind of attitude that you articulate, or that George Robertson articulated, I just don't get it at all.
Thank you, sir.
Great!
I've read your novel. I think it's a marvellous book. I really do congratulate you on it. It's a tremendous achievement. I'd like to talk just a little more, as you've already been doing, about the character of Maya. It seemed to me that she was likely to be Spanish because Maja is actually a Spanish word, and it's a couple of paintings by Goya. But she's the outsider who goes native in the place. She doesn't have a long connection with, well, she lives to be 80, it's long enough, but I mean, it's not part of her blood. And I wonder why you made that decision. I mean, you could have had a wise, intelligent woman overseeing all that was going on inside the glen from generation to generation. Whereas this woman, as a girl who's a complete outsider, who ends up in the glen purely by chance, but then she...
Just make sure we don't give too much plot away here.
No spoilers here. No spoilers, please.
Okay, I'll shut up. Well, then, would you like to talk to us about why you decided that she should come from abroad rather than that she should be somebody born and brought up in the glen?
I think in a sense, the answer to your question is actually in your question, because one of the things that is going on in this book, or that's running in the background of this book all the way through, is the notion of people coming to the glen from outside and people from the glen leaving to go out into the world. In fact, that's where the title comes from. There's a bit in the book, it's in that story set in 1809, when the minister in the glen preaches a sermon, and he says, "We have heard news of the dead, but we have not heard news of the living." And he's talking about the people who've left the glen and emigrated to North America and places where perhaps they're never heard of again, or a letter might arrive years later. So all the way through the book, Connacht himself comes into the glen from outside it. Other people in that part of the story come and go from the glen. People go off to be soldiers or to go and live in other parts of the world from the glen. And people come in, and Maya is one of the people who comes into the glen. And one of the questions hanging over that coming and going of people is, how are strangers going to be received? Are they going to be made welcome? Are they going to be rejected? Are they going to be treated well or badly? And I think what's going on there in my head was that's one of the biggest questions that we face now in the world in the 2020s. The people are on the move, and mostly they're on the move because for the very basic reason that they want to make better lives for themselves or for their children, and that's an entirely laudable aim in my view. If folk can't have a good life in the place they're in, then they'll up sticks and go to somewhere where they think they can make a better life. It's what Scottish people and Irish people and English people have done for centuries, going to North America and Australia and so on. Now it's beginning to happen from other parts of the world, people coming here. And the big question seems to me, is how are we going to receive those people? Are we going to receive them well? Or are we going to welcome them, or are we going to reject them? Are we going to treat them as our equals? Are we going to think that they're different from us? Or are we going to accept them with all their differences? That, to me, is a massive, massive question going on today, right across the world, not just in Scotland, but everywhere. But so I think the answer to your question is that's why Maya is who she is in the book, because I wanted her to be somebody who has, yes, spent most of her life here, but didn't start here. And so is she a native? Is she an outsider? She's both. And effectively, we all are. We're all outsiders in some respects, and we're all insiders. And she says something about that near the end, about the only thing she believes in is place, that everybody has a place. But sometimes people don't find the place where they really should be or where they want to be. As I said, I can't say too much more than that without sort of giving away bits of the plot, which I hope people will, if they read the book, will discover as they go through it. But that's basically the reason why I made her who she is.
Thank you, James. Perhaps time for one more question, the lady in the middle.
I've got ahead of the mic. Does that mean I get a turn? Can I just say thanks for the reading and the information about the book? I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I think for what you said about the use of Scots our time, and also the way the characters our time had developed in the book, it sounds as if it's a book that would awfully much lend itself to also being an audio book. And I think for Waynes the day, one of the things that's hard for Waynes that are trying to learn Scots or are paying attention to elders that still use their own tongue is the no being awfully confident with it. And I'm wondering whether as a book that you have already scribed, whether it would be a good idea for it to be an audio book too, and whether that is something you have considered to make it more accessible for youngsters and for older folk too.
I think this book is already an audio book.
It is, yes.
It's been recorded, so you can get it on Audible, I think it is.
Yeah.
I'll confess that I have not heard it. I know who the actors were who read the different parts, and as far as I could tell from the wee bits that I've heard, they've done a good job on it. So the Scots is there in the Audible version, and I think it's that part of that has been done. It's ticked off. So going to explore that. It was on Radio 4's Book at Bedtime, and the part of Charles Gibb was read by I've forgotten his name, Mr. Bonner. It's his first name. He was in Guilt. Did you see Guilt? I've forgotten the guy's first name now. But wonderful actor.
Sorry, I'm being no help whatsoever here. But.
If you saw Guilt, he was the older brother who got into terrible trouble in Guilt, and he's an actor. His second name is Bonner. Completely. Mark Bonner, thank you very much. Yes, so he did the Book at Bedtime radio abridgment, and they did that great. But it's different actors who do the Audible one, but they're also very good.
Yeah. Maybe lady in the middle there, just to finish off, I think. Yeah.
It's a very practical question. I mean, I would love to take up and continue the discussion that Joe started with yourself about Maya and about refugees and displaced people and all the rest of it. Because all the other people had actually decided they wanted to go into Connacht, whereas she didn't. But anyway, that's not my question. My question is, you obviously made a very conscious decision not to have a dictionary at the end of the book. You do say in the introduction about if you don't understand some of the words, you can go and look them up. Why did you do that? Was it because you want Scots to be seen as a living language and something that is still, as you said, a lot of people still use these words, maybe not in everyday language, but we would understand them. I mean, recently I had a friend whose ceiling came down and I said, oh my goodness gracious me, all that stour. And she went into absolute rhapsody about it. And she said, stour, everybody talks about the dust, but it's no dust, it's stour, Maureen, it's stour. And I think, but just back to that, why did you decide that people who were reading this book didn't need to go a glossary of the meaning of some of the words?
It's a difficult decision sometimes, but one of the difficulties, if you put a glossary in at the end of the book, as soon as somebody comes across a word that they don't get, they stop and go to the back of the book to look up the glossary. And to me, that interrupts the flow of their reading. And so what I try to do is contextualise Scots words that I think might cause a problem because they're not that familiar. I try to contextualise them so that you can read the story, and if you're not quite certain of what a word precisely means, the context should explain it if you read on, another half a sentence or so. But I do accept that sometimes that is difficult for people, which is why I put the wee note in saying, at the front, saying, actually there's a very good online Scots dictionary, and if you want to do it that way, then you can check these words out there. I'm involved in Itchy the publishing house that publishes books in Scots for bairns, and we don't put glossaries in those books either for the same reason, because your point is a valid one. If every time somebody comes across a word they don't understand, they have to stop and go to the back of the book to check it, then they never actually learn what it means. It's like when you learn English, you don't, every time you come across a word that you don't understand, you don't stop and go to the dictionary. You might do, but often you will read on, and in fact the context then gives you what that word means. That's how people learn to expand the vocabulary in English, and I believe that's how they should do it with any other language as well. But I accept that also has an effect sometimes in making people who are not familiar with Scots say, well, this isn't the book for me. But most of my books are full of Scots words, and I feel that I can only compromise my language so far, and after that, I just have to stick with it. And if that's what people get, and hopefully it's good enough to keep them reading. Apart from anything else, one of the things I find a lot of folk who are not Scots speakers have often said to me is that they actually really love that, because a bit like your lady that went into rhapsodies over the word steward. The people who don't have these words realise how rich and beautiful they are and how descriptive they are. And certainly whereabouts in Angus, where I stay, these are still commonly used words every single day. I mean, in the village where I stay, folk habitually use them all the time. So they're not dead words at all. They're very much alive.
Thank you for your questions. We are a little bit over time, so we should wrap up now, I think. Just to say, I notice the book has been shortlisted in the Sir Walter Scott Prize.
Long listed so far.
Long listed, which is down to about a dozen or so. This is, if you don't know about that, it's one of the most prestigious and, dare I say, lucrative prizes in the English-speaking world. So if James lands that one, the beers are on him, I think. But it's wonderful to see it in there amongst many other big names of historical fiction, and all the best with that.
Thank you.
Clearly, several of you have read this book. If you haven't, it comes very thoroughly recommended. I'm sure it's for sale here in the bookshop, and there's an online bookshop as well, I believe, for the festival. James, congratulations, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you.